When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be talking about Dalton Greyjoy, aka the Red Kraken. We will maybe see him in House of the Dragon. I'm not sure, given that there's only going to be 16 episodes, if we're going to have time for the character. I think it'd be a really big shame because he is I would say a fairly big part of the war. But to be fair, most of his actions occur in the West. They're not, pivotal or vital to what occurs with the main, storyline. So I could very easily see House of the Dragon just giving him footnotes like we're updated on his progress, kind of things like they did for season 1 with like the Stepstones, for instance. Like they were referencing, oh, there's the triarchy on the Stepstones and how that's impacting Westeros. Something similar could happen just in terms of like how we do have two Lannister characters that are very important to the story. It'll impact them as characters, but that isn't really to discuss in this video. We're going to talk about, in Fire and Blood, what we know about the character of Dalton Greyjoy and how he brought terror to specifically the Westerlands and the Sunset Sea. So Dalton Greyjoy is somebody that only lives to being about 20 years old, but he was born in 113 AC. Now, he's such an interesting character because, in my opinion, he parallels Corlys Velaryon quite a lot. He has a lot of grand, adventures, or I wouldn't even say adventures, but grand feats for being so young. He's also very similar, just maybe somebody like Alan Velaryon as well, and those two will definitely have some relevance in this video. So he's a bit of that, and he's also what I think Balon Greyjoy wishes he could be. Like, Dalton Greyjoy is essentially what Balon Greyjoy wanted to be. Bringing back the old way of the Ironborn and being able to basically conquer and control the entire western sea, more or less, of Westeros. And so that's kind of the premise for the character right away. He's very similar in mindset to Balon Greyjoy of the main story. But when we get into his youth, and again, he only lives 20 years, so he doesn't have a very long life. Most of his main parts of his life that we know of will occur during the dance, but we do know a little bit about his pre-life. We do know that at age 5 he began rowing, and even at 10 he began reaving. So very young, he's being integrated into the Ironborn culture and what they believe in. He sailed with his uncle to plunder the pirate towns, the Basilisk Isles, and by 14 Dalton had sailed as far as Old Geese, fought in dozen actions, and claimed 4 salt wives. Something that's very interesting about Dalton Greyjoy is he's going to have at least 24 salt wives, but he's not actually going to have a rock wife. He's not actually going to have like a quote-unquote equal like marriage, like a traditional marriage. Like salt wives don't really count in terms of that, even though, funny enough, his heirs will be born of one of these salt wives. But again, he's somebody that I think is almost a perfect mix of characters like Victarion and Balon. Maybe you could throw a little bit of Euron in there as well, being a bit cunning in how he goes about doing certain things during the dance. But I really do think he's like Victarion and Balon if they got mixed into one character. But one of the even more interesting things is that Dalton Greyjoy actually claimed a Valyrian steel longsword, which he named Nightfall. I really like that name, by the way. It's a really good name that Dalton Greyjoy names it. But it was found off of a dead corsair. Now, we do know that back in the day with Valyria, Valyrian steel swords weren't all that uncommon, but after Valyria falls, some of these swords would have became a lot more valuable. And so it's interesting that it's kind of just some no-named like corsair that he finds this extremely valuable sword. Like, think about what Tywin offers to get Valyrian steel swords and how families turn that down, even whatever their status is in terms of richness or whatnot. It's really interesting the way that Dalton Greyjoy gets that sword. But you could also be thinking, wait a second, Eric. Wait a second. The Greyjoys don't have a Valyrian steel sword. In the main story, anyway, that we know of. So where did this sword go? It's kind of weird because, when we get to the end of this video, I will leave some speculation up to what happened to Nightfall, but the sword goes to House Harlaw. We don't know why. We don't know how. It's literally, we have almost no information on this sword. Like, we have, I think if you click on the wiki for Ice and Fire, like, I'm pretty sure there's like 3 lines. There was literally 3 lines for this sword. So super, badass thing for Dalton Greyjoy to have this Valyrian steel sword already being like a prominent figure in terms of his sword ability. Like, think about a character like Victarion Greyjoy having a Valyrian steel sword. That's kind of what I imagine for the character of Dalton Greyjoy. And so already he's gaining a reputation and quite a big name. And especially when we get to why he gets named the Red Kraken, he's going to get that reputation. And so his story continues as he was fighting in the Stepstones, of course. It's where everybody goes to fight when there's not a civil war going on. And the 15-year-old Dalton avenged his uncle after watching his death. Because Dalton emerged from the fight drenched in blood from a dozen wounds, he became known as the Red Kraken. So, kind of a dark name, being in his own blood, others' blood. That's how he gets the name. It's a pretty awesome name as well. And later in that same year, Dalton returned to the Iron Islands to claim the Sea Stone chair after hearing of his father's death. So a lot of things happened for Dalton Greyjoy right away. Again, he's only 15, maybe 16 years old, depending on when his birthday was. And so at that young of an age, he claims the Sea Stone chair. His father's dead, so he can't look to him for advice. One of his uncles is dead. Another one of his uncles will die during the dance. So he is in an interesting spot where he's given a lot of power early on. It kind of reminds you of Robb Stark in a lot of ways. And now Robb Stark and the Red Kraken are very different, but the parallel is there, right? Somebody becoming a lord and or king. I don't know actually if I said he became king, but that's not the case. The Greyjoys were under the Targaryens at this point. But you get the point. Like, he was the lord. He was the person in charge. And so that's kind of great. And so that is kind of the point of this. But he began to build long ships, forge swords, and train fighters, citing that the storm is coming as the reason. Again, it really reminds you of Euron, right? Now, I will say here is I think that at this point of his life, this is only a couple years before the dance breaks out, right? We see Viserys I die in 129 AC, which would be the official beginning of the dance. And at this point of his life, this would have been around 128, 129 AC when he claims the Sea Stone chair. So the writing was on the wall, right? Then Rhaenyra and Daemon were at Dragonstone. You had the Greens in King's Landing. I feel like everybody kind of saw that there was going to be at least some succession crisis. Now, does it go extremely well for Dalton Greyjoy? For, I guess, like him as a person trying to maybe declare himself king or make the Iron Islands, separate from the kingdoms, which he never actually declares, but it kind of seems like that was his end point at the very least. And so it kind of played perfectly into his hand, and he was very much ready. Once the Dance of the Dragons breaks out, and we saw a little bit of this in House of the Dragon, it wasn't, a big focal point, but it was part of it, is, how are you going to get these great houses? How are you going to make allies? How are you going to, go against other sides' advantages? So, for instance, the one thing that the Blacks really had was they had a great fleet because of Corlys Velaryon. And so how do you break that blockade? And Otto Hightower, the Small Council, they tried a number of things. Now, one of those would have been, like we saw in the television show, and like happens in Fire and Blood as well, he reaches out to the old enemies of Daemon's. The Triarchy specifically looks to Essos for help. Now, one of the other things that they do, though, is they also leave the door open for someone like Dalton Greyjoy. Dalton Greyjoy would have been a very interesting candidate. He had a great reputation for violence. He had a Valyrian steel sword. He had all these long ships. He could create a lot of havoc and break the blockade of King's Landing and the Blackwater. And he could cause a really big, massive issue to the Blacks. And so both sides tried to give him an offer. And the funny part is, I think Rhaenyra and Daemon handle this pretty perfectly. They read the character of Dalton almost perfectly, because the Greens take more of a diplomatic approach, offering him titles and things like that. They offer to give Dalton the position of Master of Ships, and all they wanted in return, which is a lot, is they wanted him to bring his ships around Westeros to battle Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake. Now, you can see right away why this is not an enticing offer if you're someone like Dalton Greyjoy. You're getting a council seat. Like, you're going to lose how many men, how many ships, how much manpower strength. You could even die for this position that doesn't gain you a ton of wealth. Maybe it gains you a lot of reputation, but you don't gain all that much. If you even think about the Velaryons after the dance, the Master of Ships role very much, like, it's not as good as it once was. Like, back in the very beginning days of the Targaryen dynasty, the person that was the master of ships was really important because you could dictate things like, taxes or taking extra things under the crown's nose from any ships coming into King's Landing. That's huge. That's one of the reasons that House Velaryon, their wealth was so high, pre-dance. And so that's not that, interesting or intriguing of a position outside of just, okay, it boosts up your reputation. You get to come to court. Whereas the other side of it, the Blacks, who I think give a fantastic offer, is they basically just say, yeah, attack our enemies. And if you're thinking about this from Dalton Greyjoy's point of view, well, who are Rhaenyra's enemies that you're next to? Well, the Lannisters and the Reach, the two houses that you would be in the most conflict with. And so now Dalton Greyjoy has just been given a free pass to just do what he already wanted to do, inflict more violence, get more wealth, do all of those things. And so Dalton Greyjoy is basically acting in his own self-interest, but using that, oh yeah, he's on the black side of things as kind of a cover for that. And you'll see that as the war ends, like that is exactly what he does. And so that kind of starts up the campaign in the West. Dalton Greyjoy takes a very similar approach of the Greyjoy Rebellion. Outside of, they don't attack the Malisters or Seaguard, which was kind of dumb in my opinion by Balon Greyjoy, but he doesn't do any of that. But he does go straight for the Lannisters. He attacks the Westerlands, something Balon Greyjoy could have done in the main story, and decided he wasn't going to do that either. Maybe he should have taken a little bit of a note from Dalton Greyjoy, because the issue you have at this time, right, is that, when you have Jason Lannister bringing all of the Lannister power, the Westermen, soldiers, their finest men, into the conflict and going in towards the Riverlands to attack Daemon, like we see on the television show as well, it leaves the West very vulnerable. And Dalton Greyjoy sees that right away, and maybe he wouldn't be able to take Casterly Rock, same thing that Balon Greyjoy, thinks about. As Lady Joanna actually bars the gates to him, she has no men to protect the rest of the West. She doesn't have the naval power to deal with Dalton Greyjoy, and Dalton Greyjoy goes havoc on the West. He burned the fleet of House Lannister, sacked Lannisport, carrying off of gold, grain, and trade goods. Hundreds of women and girls were taken as salt wives, including the favorite mistress of Jason and their natural daughters. Dalton then tried to lead a failed capture of Case, and then afterwards, he took Fair Castle and Fair Isle. He claimed 4 of Lord Farman's daughters as salt wives, giving the 5th, the homely one, to his brother Veron. Lord Jason then was killed in the Battle of the Green Fork. So if you're looking at this from Dalton's point of view, you have nobody to challenge you. All of the major fleets in Westeros at this time are working on trying to either blockade King's Landing or sending relief. Dalton Greyjoy is the least of your troubles if you're, the Greens, for instance, right? Say, for instance, the Red Wine fleet or fleets that you could conjure up within the Reach. Those are going to be going towards the aid of King's Landing. That's way more valuable than the Westermen at this time, especially when you already have their army heading into the Riverlands. It's kind of already accomplished its goal, whether it doesn't go good or bad. Whatever happens there, that's what you needed to occur. And so Dalton Greyjoy sees all those things. He understands that completely. He has free reign. He can commit, war crimes. He can go back to the old ways. There's nobody to challenge him. Right? And even when you see like the Battle of the Gullet happen, again, spoilers for House of the Dragon, that completely almost wipes out a lot of the Velaryon power. Now, it doesn't completely, right? Alan Velaryon is going to keep the Velaryon power from declining. It does decline, but it doesn't like decline as noticeably until after he is dead. And so it's enough to where it's like Dalton Greyjoy, even if the Velaryons do win, it took them down quite a peg. The Dalton Greyjoy probably would feel very confident with being able to beat the Velaryons if they were to come out of the skirmish, on top. And so at this time, again, you would have seen a lot of that going on. But what I find very interesting is that Dalton Greyjoy kind of starts becoming the ruler of Fair Isle. He stays there. He doesn't actually go back to Pike. He doesn't continue invading. He kind of stays put. He almost has like this same idea of like Rhaena, now not the Rhaena of the House of the Dragon, the Dance time period, Jaehaerys' older sister, she actually had also been there too. She had stayed on Fair Isle for a long time. She became basically someone like the Queen of the West, one of my favorite characters of Fire and Blood. Something similar kind of happens here with Dalton Greyjoy. Like, he kind of just stays there overall, just ruling the western side of Westeros, which is why I titled this video the way I did, is that nobody was able to challenge him, right? The Lannisters, they could defend themselves, hold themselves up in Casterly Rock, but they could do nothing to protect their vassals and all of that. And that's made even more apparent by Fair Isle. Now, eventually, the dance would end, and that's when the attention would shift back to Dalton. Dalton is still invading one of the major kingdoms, and you also have Tywin Lannister, who is very influential in the beginning of Aegon III's reign. And so, of course, he's going to turn to his own homelands, where, his home is still being basically under siege. He's going to turn his attention to that. But what could someone like Tywin do, right? Aegon III and Tywin, they command Dalton to cease his raiding, but the Red Kraken just simply ignored them. Now, he didn't name himself king. He didn't do all of those things. But he also didn't, he didn't respect what the crown was saying. They didn't, at this time, seem like they didn't seem like they were going to do anything about it. After all of this warfare, did they really want, more war? This rebellion, probably the real Greyjoy rebellion, not Balon's, because Dalton was much more of a threat at this time than Balon really ever was. And so what Dalton Greyjoy does, which I think is hilarious, it's not hilarious for the people involved, but it's just a funny moment. Dalton basically just goes, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to do the exact opposite, because he then, who Lady Joanna Lannister had been trying to build a fleet, of course, trying to repel the Greyjoys. And what does Dalton do? Well, he burns her entire shipyards and abducts another 100 women. So that didn't go well. The West is really struggling here. And so, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Dalton never actually takes a real rock wife, right? He takes a number of salt wives, which is interesting because you wouldn't have really any, legitimate children, you would say, even though the Greyjoys look at that very differently. But, from a Westerosi point of view, he doesn't. I find that very interesting, especially when you think about the succession, right? If Dalton was to die, well, Dalton, by the time he does die in 133, he's only 20 years old. So any kids that he had would be children. And I think that's very, very, very important to understanding, I think, his legacy. But we'll get into that here in a little bit. And so while Dalton continued his rulership basically over the West, he had even thought about, at this time, of sending one of his sisters to the Maiden's Day Ball. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Maiden's Day Ball, basically Aegon III needs a new bride to continue the line of succession. The Targaryen dynasty was at its most fragile, so it was a desperate attempt to really get him a new wife, and it was really orchestrated by Lord Peake to get his own line basically connected to the throne. The Peakes, always the most likable house, but it doesn't go his way, but that's not really the point of this. But all we do know is that Dalton kind of decides against it. Now, I think it would have gone very poorly if Dalton would have sent someone there, because they would have just been held as a hostage against him. Now, would he have cared? I don't know. We're not, sure how his relationship was with his sisters, but I'm just saying it's probably what would have happened. They would have become a hostage more than they would have actually married the king. We do know then at this time, the Westermen again defend case, and in this attack, there was actually a big blow to Dalton. Dalton's favorite uncle actually was killed during this. And so Joanna, who had maybe gotten some confidence from this, a victory of defending in this battle, she sends a ragtag fleet to try and take back Fair Isle. She tries to take this fleet and go take back Fair Isle. Well, that doesn't necessarily go the best, as the Ironmen ambushed the Westermen, and Dalton sent the heads of Lord Prester, Tarbeck, and Erwin Lannister to Johanna at Casterly Rock. And so this is, I think, when I would say the crown starts to take Dalton Greyjoy more seriously, because at this point, now, there's numerous reasons why this happens. But it still made sense, even though this move is done, in my opinion, more out of spite and for power than anything. I think Lord Unwin Peake actually makes a lot of sense in sending Alan Velaryon to try and deal with Dalton Greyjoy. Alan of Hull, or Alan Velaryon as he gets legitimized, is probably the best naval commander that's available. He is somebody that doesn't maybe live up to Corlys Velaryon, but is still a great, heir, more or less. He's one of the greatest naval commanders that we know of. And so he is tasked with, taking a fleet and of dispatching Dalton from the west. Now, this was done more because of Alan and his influence and things like that, because Lord Unwin Peak was really trying to control the crown, and he also was not very pleased with the results of the Maiden's Ball. So that is what becomes tasked to Alan. Now, Alan would, start gathering ships and heading to the west, but Dalton responded by gathering more long ships to Fair Isle and the coasts of the Westerlands, preparing for this almost epic naval battle or war that we never really get to see. It would have been kind of like a Battle of the Gullet 2.0, but without the dragons, more or less, because at this point, the dragons were gone. That's another thing if you're Dalton Greyjoy. The Greyjoys, bent the knee, to the dragons. And I know it's not like them, like they weren't the people that got taken out by Aegon, right? The Greyjoys were not in control of the Iron Islands when Aegon came over, but it's the same idea of like the Starks. The Starks bent the knee to the dragons, and now there's no dragons left. There's Targaryens. I mean, well, there is dragons left, but they're not like full-grown dragons. Like, not the type that would really scare you, right? And so when you have this big of a navy, if you're able to beat Alan, right? This is my thinking. If I'm the Red Kraken, Alan is still not the most tested naval commander at this time yet. He is a good one, but he's not the most tested. I'm thinking to myself, if I can win this one naval battle, I have free reign of the entire West, and I could even look to strike deeper into Westeros, which is exactly what Dalton Greyjoy threatens. And so I think Dalton Greyjoy is actually kind of smart. In my opinion, this is the most logical time that the Greyjoys, even though the House Greyjoy and the Ironborn as a whole are not the most populous or the richest household in the world, at this time they can gain those things because there's no one to repel them, right? And so this is a huge building moment, but unfortunately, we would never actually see it. Now, Dalton Greyjoy did make his intention clear. He wanted to conquer the Shield Islands and Driftmark and sack Old Town and Sunspear. I would assume that he might have even gone further into King's Landing as well. But unfortunately for him, that would never occur. I find one of the most interesting deaths for Dalton is you would think Dalton Greyjoy would go out in this big battle or something along that line, but he actually has an even more sweeter death. All the women that he misused and took and all these different things, and the thing that gets him killed is, well, a woman. The thing that he looked down upon, that he took all these salt wives of, that he boasted of, well, one of them, known as Tess, kills him, cutting his throat with his own dagger before throwing herself into the sea. It's quite a dark tale as she kills herself afterwards, which I can't blame her, given the fact that when you think about it, if she had been caught, she would have been tortured, brutally murdered. I mean, there wasn't any good outcome for her. But I think for her taking in, her own action, right? Freeing herself of the pain that she was probably going under because of Dalton Greyjoy. It's a very, I think, bittersweet ending for the character of Dalton Greyjoy, because it's not the ending you would expect. It's like the perfect George R.R. Martin ending to a character, where it's something that makes complete sense based off the character, but it's not necessarily what you would expect, right? What I would have expected, what I expected reading this for the first time would have been, oh, Alan and Dalton have this battle. Alan's able to beat him, rising as the best naval commander in the realm, and that's how it goes down. No, not at all. And so what we're going to talk about then, the rest of the video, is kind of his legacy. And so the Iron Islands, they would kind of have a succession struggle for the next bit of time, whether it was, ambitious cousins. Dalton had a number of sisters. He had a couple kids, notably Torrhen Greyjoy and Roderick Greyjoy. And so how this kind of all ends out is the Greyjoys more or less get pushed, and I should say the Ironborn get pushed back to the Iron Islands, and Lady Johanna finally gets her vengeance as she sails to the Iron Islands, and she's actually able to do a number of things. She kills 2 of Dalton's sisters, 9 of his cousins, and takes his younger son Roderick and gelds him and makes him the new Casterly Rock Fool. Now, Regardless of whatever you think about Dalton Greyjoy, I think he's a pretty vicious guy, pretty hardcore guy. I want to point out here that his son would have been less than 5 years old. That just should never be done to a child. And so it's almost what the dance is. It's this brutal, war because of revenge and vengeance and all these different things. And it's just it's forwarding Dalton's legacy. And his legacy will carry on all the way down to the main story of the old way and how great it is, when in reality, it didn't accomplish all that much in the end for the Greyjoys. They still got pushed back to the Iron Islands. They didn't grow any really richer based off of it, and it just caused them and their family more harm. And so what we do know, and what ends up coming of all of this, is that eventually his son, Torrhen Greyjoy, becomes the next Lord of the Iron Islands. But what I find really interesting is that Dalton's sword, Nightfall, eventually passed to House Harlaw. We don't know how that occurs. I talked about that at the beginning of the video. I don't think that this topic is enough for its own video, so I thought I might as well include it here at the back end as well. But I do think that the likely option of why it eventually passed to House Harlaw is likely, think about the circumstances, right? The new, lord for the Greyjoys would be a child. How did he actually get put onto the Sea Stone chair? I think it's likely a situation in which House Harlaw got the sword because of their loyalty to the Greyjoys and reestablishing them on the throne. I think that makes a lot of sense. It could also be some situation like after Dalton's death, House Harlaw just eventually got their hands on it, but I don't think that would add up all that much, because eventually you would assume, wouldn't the Greyjoys then take that sword back from House Harlaw at some point? Wouldn't there be some bitterness over that sword? It seems to have been given to them willingly, right? And so I think that really makes sense given the way that this whole event and character plays out, is that a son that he has that was extremely young somehow retains, his power he somehow retains the Sea Stone chair, which would obviously show that he had a lot of backing, and that had to have probably been by the Harlaws. So that is my explanation. You got to also remember the Harlaws, very close to the Greyjoys. We see that in the main story as well. So yeah, let me know what you guys think about the Red Kraken, about his sword Nightfall, and what do you guys think about Dalton Greyjoy? But I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.